All right, I really appreciate you all taking the time to tune in for this one. Restorative Strength Training for Tactical Athletes will be the second of our 2021 webinar series. If you did miss it, Offset Training was our first one for this, which we put out about 2 weeks ago. Nevertheless, I did want to mention right out of the gate here that although this is titled for tactical athletes, I do want to be clear in saying that there's going to be a ton of content found throughout this that's going to be conducive for multiple populations, irrespective of what you do or what you're training for. Additionally, I will also have a lot of content kind of jammed into this. This is going to be an overview fashion, so I am going to move at a quick pace, but please know that we're going to provide a ton of links in the caption section on the YouTube channel here, and you'll have access to more information on a lot of these subtopics that are found throughout. So please don't feel overwhelmed by any means. Restorative strength training is something that's been kind of developing for me over the last 3 or 4 years through my work at VHP. And this is something that I've put in a tremendous amount of intricate thought to. And I believe that there's a lot to be said when working with a predominantly injured population. And basically what it comes down to is you become so strapped and limited in terms of what they are eligible for or what they can do or perform safely or effectively that you're really kind of forced to look at things from a different lens. So restorative strength training in the general sense is just a composite or an amalgamation of several different training methods that are really just utilized in a versatile way to accommodate for athletes that have wide sweeping and wide spectrum injuries and in some sense limitations. This really forces the coach or the practitioner to just become an extremely good problem solver in just the most general sense possible. You have to be able to look at things logically, objectively, and in a timely fashion in that you're not going to be overwhelmed by the moment, but you're going to be able to work your way through things and understand that there are layers or tiers to what you are doing. With this, the entire premise of the training piece is going to be developed from this injury profile, both past and present. You know, I kind of look at it at the start with 3 different questions, and those being, what are the boundaries, or what are they just physically and literally incapable of doing in the short term? What are their vulnerabilities? So things that they may be physically capable of doing, but they don't perform well or with proficiency, and then by default kind of start to present unnecessary risk, or in more common case and less extreme is just they aren't doing things with any kind of return on investment. And then the third question being, where can they improve? What can we do that's going to have actionable and tangible change? Ultimately, the human body aspires for balance, but it will make do with anything and any resource it has available to it. It's an amazing compensatory machine. It's the reason why we've been able to evolve and survive for so long as we have. So really with this population, our job is to help find their balance or help bring them back to a more equilibrium state. These are people that have so many decades of stress accumulation, of physical trauma and physical stress accumulation, and the emotional piece and all these different factors that are really just bearing down on them start to wear away at their physical state and ability. So for us, it's a major goal to try to preemptively help bring them back to a midline. And this requires us to be versatile. We can't get siloed in our work. Just because we may have the label of a strength and conditioning coach, it doesn't mean that we're not, at the very least, informed of these external modalities or these other treatment modalities that can help influence our training directly. So restorative strength training is really more of a shift in perspective and priority than it is programming or application. As you'll see here on the foundational 6 pillars, there's nothing independently on any of these pillars that is going to stand out or be remarkable in and of itself. These are things that are common throughout any specific background or any type of specific training focus. And with this approach, we are committed to principles, not methods. And those principles being outlined over here on the right side of the slide. When the principles are firm and they are in place and understood, the methodologies or the applications can be interchangeable. What we are looking for is an athlete-driven solution. I don't care if it requires a barbell or if it requires all band loading or if we're just going to be doing conditioning or if we are just going to be doing heavy loading. Whatever is required is what is going to be done. This again speaks back to the versatility piece, but something that I didn't mention too much on the first slide is how this requires us to be adaptive with our practice. We have to be continuously learning. We have to be continuously exploring and investigating different options, not only within the training facility itself, but also outside of the training facility with other professionals, practitioners, or modalities that can help the athletes. When you are solutions-based and you are athlete-driven, you really begin to strip away or erode the subjective nature of coaching. And when you strip away the subjectivity to things, you really can kind of hone in on exactly what is going to be most effective for the athlete. Broadly speaking, what we're trying to do is maintain their strengths while developing their weaknesses. A word that we're going to talk about a lot throughout this presentation is attrition, but to speak to it quickly here, these are athletes that have a tendency to be very robust where they're strong, and then very, very deficient where they are weak. So what we're trying to essentially do is try to close down the margins of difference between what is strength and what is weak. This can include singular traits such as flexibility versus strength, or it can become more specific such as dynamic versus high volume strength. We can also tack on a difference in systems proficiency in that we can look at the difference between the nervous system function versus the cardiac or the aerobic function. And this can help us to delineate between training modes and decide between how much time we're going to designate across each. It should be expected or understood, but the individuality of this population is non-negotiable. Cookie cutter templates, pre-cut templates just simply won't work. So we need to make sure that we are able to, again, be able to adapt on the fly and rely more on the autoregulatory type of training. All of this is going to be conducted under the premise of autonomizing the athlete. Obviously, this is a population that includes all adults, but in addition to that, these are adults who take training very, very seriously. They take the ability of their bodies or their performance extremely seriously, so they're going to be enriched in what you are providing for them. So I think it's a major part of our duty to sincerely and thoroughly apply informative backing to the concepts and the practices that we're implementing. They want to know how they can continue to do more beyond just our time together. So for this, I think of our role as being that of an extension, not necessarily a pillar or something that they need to be reliant on. We just want to try to extend their reach and their ability to be autonomous on their own. Building on that a little bit, one thing that for me I'm very fortunate of is that I'd never had any foresight or heads up on getting into this job. This is something that just kind of occurred overnight almost. And for me, it never gave me this window of opportunity to go out and try to look up a bunch of shit on Instagram or watch a bunch of crazy YouTube videos, Netflix documentaries, whatever, and try to kind of assimilate the culture to what I would think it would be. I would have been completely wrong across the board, so everything for me was really an organic development. Again, it's another thing I've just been really grateful for. But to get to the point on this one, we don't want to follow this poor rhetoric of the fact that because we're working with military or tactical athletes, everything has to be, super fucking high intensity and we have to always go hard into failure and not mention anything about pain or injuries. We just kind of push through all the time and, have shirts off, running around, loud music and shit. It's really a poor representation of what this population really demands. And what it starts with is just simple professionalism and expertise. I think that the best thing that I can provide for these athletes and the best way that I can demonstrate that I care for them as individuals or humans is just being extremely knowledgeable and proficient with my job. I am a subject matter expert that they have sought out to come to for a specific focus. So we can do the smile and meet and greets and bullshit and be friendly all day that we want, but at the end of the day, true professionalism is just knowing what you're talking about and then being able to get it across or apply it in an effective and efficient manner. So for the military as a whole, but when you start to consider the special operations and the special forces communities, there really isn't any other or better way to describe it than that of being a battle of attrition. They are subjected to so much extreme and so much intensity and volume. It really is difficult to comprehend without experiencing it firsthand or in some cases vicariously, but the amount of stress in and of itself is truly imperceptible to the common person. And from the selection processes early on at the start of their career through, multiple deployments across multiple decades, and then getting all the way through to retirement and having an amalgamation of injuries and stress and surgeries and all this shit that you have to transition out with, and then just, somehow miraculously find yourself in another career. It is a grueling road. And as a civilian, I can say objectively that this is not the type of shit that everybody is cut out for, point blank. I have just the utmost respect and true admiration for these individuals. It's amazing what they can overcome. But to the topic here, these are just a couple of very generalized broad pillars that kind of surmise the events and the endeavors and the demands that they're subjected to over all these years. And we can start with the easy ones, being sleep deprivation and stress inoculation. The sleep cycles are something that, I think we know about it, but we don't, again, really understand it. But there are so many complications from sleeping 4 to 4.5, 5 hours a night for 5, 10, 15, 20 years that are really going to take a long time and a lot of effort to undo. And with this, we're going to normally see severe complications to hormone panels and central nervous system function, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system function and balance. And, this ties right hand in hand with the stress inoculation. As a strength and conditioning coach, we're of course going to be limited with what we're eligible or able to apply per our scope of practice. But just because we're not literally applying or doing these certain modalities or methods, it doesn't mean that we can't or don't need to be informed on them. So there's been so many instances in my situation where I don't do physical therapy. I don't do soft tissue work in the conventional sense, but I adopt some concepts from those practices, and then in our way, I apply them as it would, fit our scope. So I think we get a little bit too siloed into the, we're strength and conditioning coaches, so we have to do strength and conditioning stuff. And that's not always the case. If we look even further down at the compromised family life, this is not an indictment on this community by any stretch of the means, but it is a simple reality of their life and their work. So, this is another realm where we're going to get competing stressors, and we're going to have, a lot of underlying issues or problems that may not present themselves initially, or perhaps in some cases at all. But we need to make sure that we are constantly being interactive with our athletes, because the more that we can kind of develop that rapport, the more that they can feel that they are in a comfortable space, that they can focus exclusively on the work piece. With these overload syndromes, we're thinking back to our compounding injuries and our compounding stressors. We have extreme mechanical overtaxation, where their roles and their duties are going to be infinitely repetitive and redundant, where they're going to develop gross asymmetrical imbalances. They're going to develop arthritic joints and adhesive capsules and all these different microitises because of the repetitive nature at such high extreme demands and frequencies. But the oddities in the outcomes of this world are quite really bizarre. A story that always comes to mind of one of the athletes that I've worked with when I think about the attrition pieces, I had an individual who was in a vehicle accident and had a bar roll through and on top of his head, and basically it crushed the back right quadrant of his head and ultimately severed his pituitary gland. So this is a dude who at like 30, 32 years old or something was never going to organically or naturally manufacture or synthesize any hormones ever again, really. And so this is a situation where I can put all these different training programs and exercise selections in place, but he would come in on Monday and be like, yeah, I feel great, let's get after it, ready to go. And then by Wednesday, he's like, I had trouble getting out of bed today. So there's a lot of variable to this, and it's just another example or illustration of being able to play that role as a versatile problem solver. Some of the common injuries that we're seeing, the head trauma is a big one that is very difficult, and it's almost deceptive because this isn't something that you can really test or assess or measure in a quantifiable way without having access to some pretty sophisticated technology or medical device. So really, this is a kind of a conversational piece that we just kind of let unfold and see what we see with it. But in addition to the head trauma, shoulders and necks are going to be torn up. I would say realistically, without exaggerating, about 70 or 80% of the people that we see are going to have some type of spinal pathology, if not multiple. The hips and the feet and ankles, just again as a manifestation of their work, are just going to be beaten to shit. We see a lot of hip impingement, FAI, labral tears, everything from moderate to complete. And at the foot, ankle, and Achilles complex, we're going to see just a bunch of wear and tear there. A lot of Achilles tendinopathy, chronic ankle sprains, plantar fasciitis, shin splints. These things are pretty common. And then we'll obviously see the unorthodox injury, and even though it's not exceptionally common, it is something that we do work with, and that is to include a lot of the metabolic diseases as well, with cancers and neuropathogenic disorders and things of that nature. But if we look to the chart on the right here real quick, and we'll take a look at a video here in a second, so we don't need to go through this in too much detail, but this is an actual case of mine, and it's honestly a very run-of-the-mill or mild case. And when you look at injuries in singular fashion, honestly, there aren't very many that are difficult or complicated to work through or around when in isolation. Where it really starts to get difficult is when you start to accumulate 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major injuries over a 5 or 10 year period. That's really where things start to get ambiguous. And as I've kind of mentioned, it's where a lot of the training methodology and applications have been born from. In this case, this was an athlete who was an extreme high performer. We were able to train real hard and got some really impressive results. All right, so if we take a quick look at a static assessment or evaluation here, the main things that we're looking for on this are the broad parameters, or just kind of the edges of the puzzle piece, right? Where you can't really infer too much from static assessments, but nonetheless, they give you good landmarks and things to work off of. So we'll run through this real quick, but the first things that stick out to me are, number one, if we look at the angle of the neck and the head position here, this on the left side being his pre-photos, the angling here, we can see he's kind of cocked over to the right, and you can see here down in the neck, SCM, scalenes, some of his, like, even collarbone area, some subclavius. You can just see that it's all tensed and fired up, so he's kind of protruding or pushing the head forward. And then obviously here we see, a pretty noticeable drop or slope in the right shoulder. And this is a guy who has had several injuries, to include multiple shoulder injuries. So these are things that are to be expected. But again, it's good to just identify or know. We can always look to the hands too and see the presence or degree of internal rotation at the hands. That's usually a good tipping point for what's going on at the shoulder, kind of how their resting posture or position is. And then, we come down a little bit lower. I had mentioned that he was coming off of a knee injury here, so we're looking at a right meniscus as the most recent. And again, we go back to the angles or the relative positioning of each limb, and we see on the right leg here, this leg is kind of collapsed in. It's in a little bit more of like a resting valgus state, as opposed to here we can see, that this is a little bit more of a neutral position here. So coming down and looking at a posterior view, we're going to see a lot of the same things, just from the opposite side. Again, you can very clearly see the displacement of the head here being pushed over to his right. And a lot of the times that creates, compensatory shrugging through the opposite trap. And you can see there's a little bit more development here in the upper trap than on the right side. The slope of the right shoulder, again, being present from the back side, we can see he's just kind of being pulled down, it looks like, almost in his right side here. And what this is going to infer as well is that there's going to be some positioning of the rib, or there's going to be some issues with positioning of the rib cage. We can also infer disruptions or impairment to scapulohumeral rhythm, resting scapular position. So it does not indict the athlete, but it does give us a good starting point. And, again, to touch on the backside here, that pronounced drop of the medial drop of the leg here, we can then from there infer that there's probably going to be a little bit of excessive pronation or collapse at the ankle or the midfoot. And, these, again, are very common things, and in singularity are not indictments, nor are they necessarily good or bad things. They're just purely observational. But as you can see here across our time, not only do we add, I think he ended up putting on about 7 pounds of muscle in 4 weeks, lost 4 or 5 pounds of fat, but you can see he's just more appropriately distributed and balanced. And I think that, we can still see that there's some drop in the shoulder here. But again, it's not that is in and of itself a bad thing. It's something that's probably always going to be there for the rest of his life. But we can definitely see that we got him to be a little bit more cleaned up. He's still putting a little bit, more pressure on the left leg than I would like to see in this. But, the angling of the leg has cleaned up a little bit, and we're getting a little bit more even distribution of pressure. But you can tell he's still kind of stacking and planning on the one side. And then again on the back side here, some development of the lower trap and the rhomboids, trying to kind of get him out of and away from his upper traps. But a lot of lat work, a lot of tricep work. And then down for the meniscus, this is going to be a pretty even distribution of front to back work for the meniscus sake. But for a lot of our athletes, the reality of it is there's a severely distorted perspective of training. And if you were down at Soreneck's Summer Strong this year and you were able to catch VHP's presentation, this is one that I spoke on, and I think that this is probably honestly the most important aspect of it, and that is recognizing the role of the strength coach to be able to modify or influence the perspective of training itself. And we need to be a conduit of not just resource, but kind of guidance on how to develop a plan that is actionable and sustainable for the athlete for where they are now. We have the crowd that is, that's under the impression that they've been compromised. They've, gone through this almost like alpha to average transition where they feel like all they are now is just a shell of what they used to be. And for them, we need to break them out of that. We need to show them that there's, more that they can do now that just is in a different avenue or towards a different outcome. And that kind of ties right into the second point, which is, being able to modify or manage expectation and goals, and being able to kind of help them form ones that are maybe not even just more realistic or reasonable for them, but maybe more incentivizing, where it gives them something new to sink their teeth into. And then for the crowd that's treated as if they're fragile or brittle, these are athletes that have just been enveloped in bubble wrap by everyone and told everything they can't do. And, sometimes for us, we can be that outlet for them to just say, hey, yeah, you've got some things that are holding you up a little bit right now, but shit, man, we'll get after it as much as we can and try some different things and see what happens. And just the sheer excitement of opportunity for them a lot of the times can be a game changer. To start out here, I know this is something that's discussed ad nauseum, but the health and wellness piece, the sleep quality piece, and really just the cognition or mental acuity piece for this population is non-negotiable. And as we know, the ability to train hard is going to be predicated on our ability to recover well. The starburst effect of sleep, which is something that I'm taking here from Alex Oliver, who's not just the owner of VHP, but also a personal mentor of mine. Alex laid this on me a couple years back, and it was really powerful and profound for me to see it laid out this way, because as you see, there's nothing on here that's spectacular, and we all recognize the importance of sleep. But he said that if you take away any of the surrounding variables from sleep, virtually nothing changes. But if you take sleep out of the equation, every single one of them around sleep becomes compromised. And this is absolutely true and very important for us to appreciate. Because again, we can be going through the greatest training program in the world, but if we're not addressing this, then it's really all for naught. And I think that, with the sleep piece, it's really important to be actionable with it. We can't just continue to regurgitate that getting a good night's sleep is important, and you got to, make sure that you're, sleeping 8 hours a night and whatnot. Well, if somebody comes to you on average sleeping 4.5, 5 hours a night, just reiterating to them that they need to sleep 8 hours a night is not going to do anything positive for anybody. In fact, all it's really going to do is remind them that they're not getting adequate sleep. So we really like to emphasize being actionable with this, and it starts with sleep hygiene. And with sleep hygiene, the biggest thing about it is we have to make sure that this is habitual. It has to be consistent. And this is something that's going to take some practice, right? Again, we think about 10, 15, 20 years of a sleep cycle that consisted of laying down somewhere around 11 or 12, not falling asleep until really 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then getting up around 6. We're going to have some shit to work through, and we got to be patient with it. But with this, the big rocks are, again, it must be routinized. So you want to try to get to bed between 1 to 2 hours every single night, 7 days a week. Don't be good on the weekdays and then, let it go to shit on the weekends. You really need to develop some consistency and habit here. And then monitoring your blue light exposure, monitoring your food and water intake. Those are the basics. From there, you want to kind of get into the environment or the quality of the sleep space. That's something that gets overlooked a lot. And then there is the technology piece, which is on a rapid uptick right now. And I'll be honest in saying that I'm not inherently or overwhelmingly a fan of a lot of the tech pieces. Something as simple as an Oura ring is usually a good one for people to put into place. It's not that expensive. It's not very invasive or demanding. It's super intuitive to set up and follow. So this is something that can help develop the accountability piece and, into a sense, the informational piece, because it'll give the athlete the opportunity to assess how manipulating their day affects their sleep that night. And over time, they can kind of hone in on variables that they can control to help contribute to a better opportunity for sleep. Navigating the recovery gauntlet is another one, and this is also something that I have a standalone video on, so this will be one of the links we'll provide below. But to kind of gloss over this rather quickly here, I look at the recovery gauntlet as something that's, again, misrepresented, where we hear it over and over again that the best recovery you can get is an 8 hours of sleep a night and eating food and drinking your water. And yeah, no shit. But the problem with that kind of suggestion is that it really undermines true recovery tools and applications, because those aren't recovery tools. Those are basic fundamental demands of biology. So in other words, that's like saying the best way to get straight A's is to show up to school. Yeah, of course, we get it. But we have to look beyond that. And again, when you look at when you add injuries into the mix, this is something that is just a part of the process. So, stepping off of my pedestal here, I categorize restrictions in one of three ways: movement, fluid, or pain-based restriction. And each of those broad descriptions has certain modalities that are more or less effective for them. So if we see here for movement restrictions, we're going to look to SMR, or self-myofascial release techniques, and or mechanical, which is your dynamic stretching, your joint mobilization, etc. For fluid restrictions, we're going to look to the circulatory piece. A big one for me is flossing and or blood flow restriction. I tend to get a lot of value out of that. And then in addition, we have some of our miscellaneous options. If we look at pain restriction, you notice that this is associated to all four of the modalities that are lined up or listed over here. When we have pain restrictions, it is very difficult to identify singular variables or culprits. So really with the pain restriction, it tends to just be a shotgun approach. But we'll take a look at a video here overviewing what we plugged in the past that we call Restorative Sundays. And this is just another kind of facet or layer to it, where it just helps kind of create or maintain that sense of patterning or lifestyle behavior, that recovery is simply a part of what we do. And when you're training at high intensities, in conjunction to having a high stress job, in conjunction having a high stress job that is physically demanding, you need to make sure that you're proficient with recovery. So now we'll take a quick look here at a sample of one of our Restorative Sunday series, which is something that we were kind of running with for a little while. But nevertheless, the concept here is to help drive home the point or emphasis of the fact that your recovery is just a part of what you do. It's a part of your week. You anticipate and plan it or program it no differently than you do training. So designating some time on Sundays is just a way that at least we found some success with, to, if nothing else, have a concerted 20 to 30 minutes a week of just good holistic movement or therapeutic movement. So we'll run through these real quick, but anything is really fair game here. We like to start off with some kind of circulation application, so flossing or blood flow restriction, or real easy good ones to go to. Then kind of some tissue work or some smashing. Then you'll see we'll get into more of our conventional mobility movements, some activation, core work, getting up into some of the upper T-spine, or some of the upper body or T-spine here. Again, back with some traction, and finishing it out with some breathing. So you can plug and play these with anything, but in addition to that, making sure that you're staying on top of your weekly staples, staying hydrated, sleep quality, quantity, and just staying outside and being active. But a typical restorative Sunday here. And shout out to first the man, the myth, the legend, Rocky here, and then Eric for jumping in on this with us. But you see here, so we each got ankle floss on, and we're just kind of doing random patterning. There's real no rhyme or reason to this. We would spend, give or take 2 minutes or so on each foot. Then we're working into, tennis ball smashing here. So this is for foot and arch compliance, just getting the individual muscle fibers of the foot to kind of start to, move and activate for themselves. Now getting into our mobility piece here, boys getting into some wrestling, but here's just a couple of T-spine drills that we're going through here. This band pull is a good one, using the foam roller to kind of block the leg. And then after we get into once we've gotten into the mobility piece, then we'll go into some activation work. So something simple here like a dead bug, bird dog, all of these are fair game. Crawling patterns are always good to throw in. Getting back to some tissue work or some SMR work here with our T-spine. This is a common one where you're just going to kind of find different vertebral junctions to get into, and that lacrosse ball or that peanut helps to create some more space between the joint and, in theory, get some good fluid into the joint, or into the vertebra rather. Then finishing out with some neck traction and some belly breathing. So again, just an easy way to habituate or make routine of getting your recovery in and taking care of your little things. Moving on to our second piece here. Now we're going to look at the aerobic system, both in terms of capacity and function. And the best way that I can describe aerobic proficiency is make fatigue hard to find. That cliche saying or old adage of, fatigue makes cowards of us all is absolutely true. So I just think to try to make fatigue hard to find. The three main KPIs or key performance indicators, as far as we're concerned, are your basics, right? We're looking at resting heart rate, we're looking at HRV or heart rate variability, and we're looking at capacity. So with resting heart rate, and we can also kind of tie working heart rate into there as well, that is truly your 101 rudiment standard. That is just basic function, and the number that we're going to look at there is going to be 60 beats per minute. So if they have a resting heart rate that is above 60 beats per minute, we're going to start out with a reasonable amount of aerobic-based work. However, for athletes that come in with a resting heart rate that's in the low 50s or mid 50s, we're not going to spend too much time on it because it's already something that you're good with, and we don't need to really add to anything because we'll just really be wasting time. Working heart rate, again, we can have a little bit of a further discussion there, but that's going to speak more to the efficiency piece. And with efficiency, we're always going to look to HRV as well. Now, HRV is something that is become a lot more trendy in just general population recently, and I think this is definitely one that a lot of people think that they understand, but they don't. But with HRV, what we're looking at is actually kind of the merging or the integration between the central nervous system and the cardiac system or the heart. Because of the electrical activity or component to the heart function, the brain waves or the DC potential, the central nervous system is going to be directly responsible for our heart rate function. Now, the variability piece speaks to beat-to-beat variation, and what we're going to want to see, broadly speaking here, is having some slight deviations between beats, and we want to see a pattern where the heart rate is basically able to stabilize, or there's a detectable pattern across multiple iterations of R-to-R waves or intervals. Putting that in more layman's terms, we want to make sure that we're not treating HRV with just physiological or metabolic applications. This is, again, something that is going to be directly tied to the central nervous system as well. Capacity is a little bit more individualized. This is going to be dependent on what their operational duties are. Are they having difficulty with capacity or durability within their operational duties? And then from there, I just kind of look at it as, are you more limited by volume or are you more limited by intensity? If it's a volume limitation, we're going to focus more on the aerobic side, whereas if it's an intensity limitation, then we're going to focus a little bit more on the anaerobic side. With all of these KPIs, we want to make sure that we are stratifying our approach. So for me, I use a very simple red, blue, green scale. So my red indicates more of my lower function athletes, or the athletes that are perhaps coming off of a major injury or surgery, or they're just generally, a little bit older. So some of our veteran population. But these are going to be athletes that are going to predominantly focus on aerobic work. We're really not going to get much time on the anaerobic side. It's not that we won't eventually get there. However, immediately or initially, we want to make sure that we're staying more on the aerobic side. Blue is going to be more of our transitional type of athletes. So these may be individuals who are, kind of in the back half of their career, but still active duty. They're in good shape, but not great shape. And they still have some of their, strength qualities or some of their conditioning capacity from their earlier days, but they've started to encounter more injuries. We've started to encounter more chronic pain. So we're going to get more of an even split here. As for the green athletes, these are our studs, or, kind of our younger tier athletes. So early phase in their career, peak velocity growth, obviously going to be proficient aerobically because of the demands at their command or their base. So for us, we're going to put most of our time into the anaerobic methods, or some of our power speed work. Again, generalizing, but the applications, modes, and parameters here are going to be everything that you would see in a textbook, anywhere from 1 to 3 days per week, depending on where they're at, depending on where they're trying to go. 10 to 40-second work intervals. That's going to speak more to aerobic versus the anaerobic side. And then again, similarly with the work to rest ratios, 3 to 1, ranging to 1 to 3. Now, you notice that I don't have much, or I don't have anything laid out above 40 seconds, and that's because that's the one piece that is almost unanimously taken care of at work or at their training. So there's no need for us to work, 3-mile iterations or any longer distances than that, because that's already where they're spending the bulk of their time. I suppose one area where I am a little bit different, or we have a different approach with our modes. So with conditioning, we essentially like to emphasize contralateral based strength circuits and just do them in a fashion that is circuitory, or that creates more of the conditioning type of effect. But just because it's conditioning doesn't mean you need to be limited to body weight, running, and stationary bikes. In fact, I try to keep that to an absolute minimum. So we'll take a look at a video here in a minute on the conditioning circuit. So I don't need to go too deep here, but the modes are important because we want to make sure that we're doing things that not only aren't compounding or compromising present injuries or dysfunctions, but we also want to try to get some of the traits that we need in terms of strength or stability through our conditioning work. And lastly, touch on some of the parameters. Really, I can't mention any of this without giving full credit to my man Rob Wilson, who's an absolute genius and has so much work done on the breathing side. But for us, we really try to emphasize mostly nasal breathing. We do try to, make breathing a concerted point. We're cueing it and coaching it and instructing it as if it's no different than anything else. It's something that's so simple, and it's such low-hanging fruit in terms of driving the efficiency of conditioning, to not have it as a part of our game plan. So if we look at this real quick as a spectrum, you see, red up at the top under the aerobic side or column, and then as we come down, we start to shift more right towards the anaerobic. Notice, though, that on the percentages here, and actually if we flip back real quick, you notice here that the percentages are almost void in the middle here, or in the mix section, 10%, 20%, 10%. And that's because if we are not aerobic enough to be aerobic, or not anaerobic enough to be anaerobic, we're not really creating much of a change or a positive adaptation. So that middle zone, or that mixed methods, is something that's really kind of kept to a minimum for me. And, back to our spectrum chart here, we'll get a little bit of it with some of that blue group, but even still, that's more of just a transitionary period before we get into more of our purely anaerobic work. All right, so if we take a quick look at an overview of what a typical conditioning session looks like, in the majority of cases for me, we're going to look at a 4 to 6 station exercise-based circuit where we're going to work unilateral movements or contralateral-based movements, and we're going to perform these under time parameters. So some of the nuances or applications here also include, I'm going to do all right side for all exercises, come back around, do all left side, and then take complete rest. So in other words, if we have a band front foot elevated split squat, a kettlebell decel lunge, a jammer single arm snatch, a chaos single leg glute bridge, and a medicine ball rebound lateral hop, we'll go through 1 through 5 all right side, then 1 through 5 all left side, then we'll take our total rest. My work sets are always going to be interval based or time based. I think that helps drive the conditioning or the metabolic effect, and kind of keeps the intent present for the athlete. Last couple of things, I tend to use a lot of dynamic or light submaximal loading, but doing so in a high intensity fashion or a high intent fashion. The last thing that we apply is trying to keep the breathing predominantly nasal. And with this, we are amplifying or emphasizing the O2 efficiency, the O2-CO2 exchange or turnover, and making, at least if nothing else, making the athlete more conscientious of their breathing patterns. So we'll go through these movements here real quick, but the parameters that we outlined right there are really the key to it. The exercises are debatable or interchangeable and always, of course, dependent on your athlete. But here we have a band front foot elevated split squat. So this is one where the band loading works very, very well. And I believe because of the dynamic lever arm or moment arm, helps to create a favorable leverage or a strong muscular advantage for the athlete. He was coming recently off of a meniscus tear, so the way that we loaded the lower body was, kind of pick and choose. But this ended up working out really well. The front foot elevated addition here, that's to kind of help preserve the amount of dorsiflexion. When we're coming off of a knee injury, I think we want to work mostly a vertical shin first and then start to get into more deeper ranges of dorsiflexion. But that's the intent here with the front foot elevated position. And one last note on this, I usually cue this to have the athlete mimic their torso angle to their shin angle. So in this case, he's a little bit more inclined at the trunk than I would like to see relative to this shin angle, but that's a way that we can help to optimize co-contraction of both the anterior and posterior thigh compartments. Number 2 here, this is a kind of a fun one. This is a kettlebell swing to lunge decel. So for this, we're really looking at coordination, timing, motor control, and then that's really the main purpose of the kettlebell, is to increase the speed or momentum coming forward, which gives you more force to decelerate in that lunge position. Then we look at a jammer single leg, single arm snatch. So you notice that the resistance and the load here are very light. The reason I like using the jammer setup in lieu of something like a dumbbell or a kettlebell here is because I don't want stability to be the main focus. Because we're trying to emphasize the conditioning aspect or the anaerobic capacity aspect, I don't want stability to be a limiting factor. I want him to just do the mechanical work and create as much pure volume as we can. So even though this one looks like it's a little bit fancy, this is actually a fairly intuitive movement. And again, another one we're looking for good timing and coordination between the leg and the arm. Single leg chaos glute bridge here. I'm sure this is one that the conventionalists and the old school coaches will love to pick apart, but again, this is something I just, in my experience, I've had success with. So the concept here, the application here, is to decrease the amount of external stability so that the muscles have to co-contract or create their own intrinsic stability. There's also a neurological proprioceptive demand. I mentioned he was coming off of a meniscus tear, so I'm thinking about the mechanoreception at the knee and then getting some good posterior contraction here, both in the calf and the hamstring. Or good co-contraction between those two, and then finishing through the glute. And then we'll come out onto the turf for something more, dynamic or open chain. So here we're just doing kind of a rebound lateral hop, using the med ball to help kind of feed the pattern and give him some biofeedback on the movement. So, again, with the knee meniscus, we're trying to help restore proprioception and his trust in the knee or the structure itself. And the med ball can help with this process by giving him a better reference point for stability and position. Our third pillar here, now we're looking to the joint integrity or the tissue quality and tone. So obviously for those of you who have been following my work, you know that this is going to be a fascia emphasis for me. The human system is a magnificent outcome of multiple individual structures performing specialized functions while coalescing as one. And I know that's some poetic shit right there, but again, a little bit more simply, the human body is dependent upon systems that are always working, and they're always working in tandem, and those produce the outcomes. I think, especially as strength and conditioning coaches, we just tend to be blind to a lot of these other systems outside of the musculoskeletal, but one of those that we need to be very adept with is the connective tissues, and those include predominantly fascia, ligaments, and tendons. And while these are all connective tissues, most of them are collagen-based tissues that have different concentrations of water in them. Each of these tissues not only has different responsibilities, but also require different training parameters and applications. So for our fascia system, this is the interwoven, top to bottom, head to toe connective tissue that is embedded with a ton of proprioceptive receptors and neural fibers. There's also mild circulatory flow, but this is an elastic tissue that has a lot of hydraulic or hydrodynamic properties. So, this is the unknown system that we're just now really starting to figure out. But for me, we think multiplanar movement, we think kinesthesia, and we think integrated patterns. We need to move in a lot of different ways and at different tempos and in different angles to really address or isolate this system. For the ligaments or our bone-to-bone connectors, we're thinking more about shear tolerance. Where the human body is rotational in nature, the ligaments are one connective tissue that really does not respond well to shearing force or torque for that matter. So with the ligaments, we want to make sure that we are putting an emphasis there. There are also joint receptors or mechanoreceptors that are embedded in ligaments, and these receptors are going to be critical for orienting joints in space and under different velocities and under different loads. So we need to be mindful of that as well. I also think about tensile strength when we're discussing ligaments, or basically stress strain. So the amount of force that the ligaments can accommodate or handle under a specific amount of time. As for the tendons, this is more eccentric loading and lengthening. We're thinking about extensibility, or the ability for the tendon rather, to stretch. And while it's being stretched, it is basically storing or compositing potential energy that is going to be rapidly utilized and transmitted as mechanical energy to follow. So with the tendons, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the GTOs, or the Golgi tendon organs, which are effectively the overbearing parent that shuts down movement before it occurs. And this is obviously a safety or preventative mechanism, but when you have repetitive injury or repetitive or high levels of chronic stress, a lot of the times these receptors can become somewhat, I don't want to say defective, but they can become damaged or dampened, and it creates a disruption to the entire process of movement. With the tendons, we're thinking about the elastic piece, the mechanical piece, and then again the neurology or the GTO piece as well. Mobility versus stability is another conversation that gets way off the rails, and I think is another one that is just grossly overdone. This isn't something that should be perceived as this or that, or mobility or stability, but rather how much of each. So to simplify all of this, I think about it simply as, is this athlete more likely to be injured because they're too stiff to avoid it, or because they're too soft to endure it? Now with the military realm, obviously we're going to see more often the too stiff to avoid it piece, but we also see cases where the too soft to endure it, or the lack of stability, is also something that needs to be addressed. With that, active versus passive range of motion is the first kind of evaluation piece that I go to, and this is another one we have a couple of standalone videos on. But with active range of motion, we're thinking about the athlete moving through a specific range of motion on their own, under their own volition. So this is really the byproduct of joint mobility plus the localized strength of the tissue. We can also make a conversation about this being, the neuromuscular proficiency or ability at the localized site. Passive range of motion, however, is the byproduct of joint mobility plus tissue flexibility or extensibility. So if we have somebody who has an active range of motion deficiency, their program is going to be more strength oriented rather than mobility or flexibility oriented. And this is a mistake a lot of people make, where we have just gotten way off track with generalizing and globalizing mobility as something that just needs to be done by everybody. That's not always true, and it's not always the case. And a lot of times you can feed athletes in the wrong direction. So the active range of motion limitation is something that can help identify that, where you won't waste a bunch of time stretching or doing mobility work or soft tissue work when strength is really a deficiency. Another one I'll look at is intolerance versus deficiency, and this is more simply intolerance being pain or discomfort, whereas deficiency is a weakness or the lack thereof. Very simply, with intolerance, we want to create firm barriers or boundaries, make sure that we do not penetrate or overdo the area, and to an extent kind of avoid it. With deficiencies, we want to attack it immediately and aggressively and make it a primary emphasis point. Finally, we take all of those different parameters and we just analyze it as it pertains to what the demands of their duty are, or sport for conventional athletes. Do they need more bending or more stiffness? Do they need more strength or more mobility? How much soft tissue versus how much flexibility? All of this should be profiled. I have an absolute ton of material on fascia, so we won't spend too much time on this here. Those links again will be provided below. But with the fascial system, this is something that I think is so conducive to the operator or the military population, because conventional bilateral compound loading is almost non-applicable. I can't tell you the last time that I put a barbell on somebody's back for back squats. I can't tell you the last time. I don't know that I've ever straight bar deadlifted somebody from the floor. Bench press is very touch and go. So in part by demand, but also in part by what I feel is truly best practice, we spend a lot of time emphasizing the fascial system in training. And with this, we're thinking about multiplanar movement. Cardinal conventional planes are a shortcoming for movement expression. The conventional sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane, it just doesn't tell the whole story. So we try to bisect those planes and create a 6-prong movement or plane of movement spectrum to work our athletes through. This is also going to be done under variable speed conditions, under variable loading patterns, types of loading, the stimulus that's being applied. We're going to try to include some rhythmic and dynamic actions. And as I've already touched on, most, if not all, of what we're going to do with people is going to be contralateral and or unilateral based. The accommodating stimulus is something that I think speaks very strongly to the receptors of the fascial system. And I think that the accommodating load is something that is very beneficial for pain management and for the nervous system. Kind of along similar lines, the soft tissue work or the self-myofascial work that we're going to do for the fascial system is another one that is going to be a derivative of pain management and injury restoration. The spectrum here for our movement and our mobility piece is going to be actually a little bit more overlapping, where the conditioning and the strength ones are almost more purely delineated between red, blue, green. With the movement and mobility, there's just going to be more overlap, because it's again something that's basically counterculture in their world, so that none of them really spend a lot of time developing these things. So we'll kind of pick and choose or split our time across both off of just a general developmental progression, but then also make sure that we are emphasizing specific to the athlete what is needed. Getting into our tissue strength, with this population, it's really going to boil down to how strong is strong enough. There's certainly a point where adding strength is going to start to work against them, and we need to be very mindful of how much strength is needed to go do what they're required to do at a high level. With this, we come back to another spectrum that is examining multiple things, in this case tissues, and we're doing this across a stratified progression. So for our properties of strength, I break this up into foundational, developmental, advanced, and peaking. This can speak globally to where we kind of associate different age ranges or developmental phases across, or we can look at this on an individualistic scale, where foundational may be post-op from a slap tear weeks 12 through 16 after they've finished conventional physical therapy, and then from there we're working into a developmental, advanced, and peaking phase. In either case, the foundational piece is going to speak mostly to the muscular system, where we are focusing on just tried and true conventional contractile strength, eccentric tempos, isometric tempos, and doing some positional work. Once we come down to the developmental stage, now we're really speaking more towards the ligaments, where once we reach the developmental phase, now we're going to be emphasizing more so the ligaments, where I'll start to work in more time under tension. We're going to start to look at some applications for shear tolerance or torque management, and then we're going to try to work on our ability to tolerate stress under time or in certain parameters. From there, we're going to get into more of the tendon specific work, which is going to be the eccentric loading, this kind of being under the provision of width, speed, or velocity, our propulsive strength or our ability to recoil, and then force transmission or tolerance. So now we're starting to get into more of the high force applications. Finally, once we get there, we'll be in our peaking phase, which I think kind of emphasizes the fascial component. And here we're going to be looking at the compliance and the elasticity, our ability to integrate kinetically and put movement into action. So going back to the how strong is strong enough conversation, I think the foundational piece, and that's what leads us to this slide here, where static versus accommodating load is another conversation that we need to look at on an individualistic manner, and not in the sense of is this a good or a bad application for somebody, but how much of each and when for each does this need to be applied. So for our static applications, we want our basic hypertrophy, fundamental strength, our strength endurance, and these are going to consist of our fundamental compound exercises, no matter how they're performed, and then these are predictive and very structured or rigid. But as we go along, or as the timeline persists, now these basic simple compound movements aren't going to have the same type of return. So rather than spending weeks and weeks and weeks fighting for 10 more pounds on a deadlift or a split squat variation, now I want to start to focus more on the variable side, where accommodating load, a lot of band work, chain work, and what I call rep without rep concepts. Now we're starting to make foundational strength mean something. And especially in this world, it usually isn't nearly as much emphasis on foundational strength as we tend to believe. I think we get a little bit more benefit for most on emphasizing this accommodating side, but again, that's something to be addressed on an individual manner. Our strength spectrum is going to go back to being a little bit more delineated, where for our foundational piece or for our red athletes, it really is just kind of that strength acclimation, where we're trying to build our strength endurance, develop some base level hypertrophy, get joints feeling a little bit better, and then we'll transition into more of our developmental hypertrophy, which is now less of a joint emphasis, but more of a cross surface area or a true muscle mass focus, kind of feeding us into our max strength work. That'll filter us down into our strength power, so now our percentages start to come back down, and now we are supplementing out our focus being strength for our focus being speed. The neuromuscular component is ultimately the governor of our movement and our function. So I categorize plyometrics broadly as either rhythmic applications or force applications, and we'll take a look at some video breakdown on this, so we don't need to spend too much time on the graphs, but nonetheless, rhythmic applications and force applications can coincide directly with what people more commonly classify plyometrics as, and those being either extensive, which as you see here is correlated to the rhythmic applications in suggesting under 75% or lower intensity plyometrics, and then on the opposite end, intensive being above 75%, and those being coupled with the force application. So plyometrics, speed work, change of direction, agility is going to almost unequivocally be the most difficult training mode or methodology to apply with this population. I tell my guys all the time that they are the best, worst athletes in the world for everything that they're capable of doing and what they can achieve physically. It's pretty amazing when you get them moving with some speed. But you'll notice, especially if you're on the conventional sports side, you'll notice that there's going to be a little bit of a peculiar nature to the way that I progress this, but hopefully I'll make it make sense here. Sprinting is going to be a very, very slow, long progression for most athletes that I'm going to see, or that you'll see in the military realm. And if you think about it, when these athletes are demanded to run, it's always a few things. One of them being reactionary, and generally speaking, in a high stress, high intensity situation, they're going to be under pretty significant amount of load, typically right around 35 upwards to 65, 70 pounds. And then they're also going to usually be carrying a weapon, or at the very least be significantly unbalanced due to kit and then, weapons and so forth. So when you start getting into the dynamic or the locomotive patterning, the sprinting work and the change of direction work, it looks very cumbersome, awkward, and goofy. And that's to be expected. So I break this up early on into low-level plyos, general extensive plyos, and med ball throws. And with these, what we're really trying to do is just assimilate them, or kind of get them introduced to moving like an athlete, establishing some rhythm, motor function, changing of force vectors, and kind of getting comfortable moving in undefined or ambiguous ways or planes of motion, and just simply trying to get them away from being so rigid and tonic all the time. But the low-level plyos are going to be kind of warm-up, movement prep, maybe some intraset work. And then on the extensive plyo end, this is something that I'll carve out more of an entire training session or day for. And this will normally be coupled with something like med ball throws. But the extensive plyos, we're thinking low amplitude, so a lot of low box drills, a lot of box drills to remove or absolve eccentric force, and doing things with, a very strong emphasis on the technique, the cueing, the form proficiency, and kind of just the general feel. So biofeedback is something that I'll use often with this population, and that's something we'll talk about in the video voiceovers. As for the force applications, I mentioned that there would be a peculiar progression here, and so, my college coaches are probably looking at this a little funny right now, but I am going to seek to lift weights fast or with a velocity intent pretty thoroughly before I start getting into too much sprint or change of direction. Because this population is usually so just, again, tonic or tight and bound up, a lot of the times they have a difficulty when they don't have something to utilize to express their tensioning. So when I have a deadlift bar in my hands or a hex bar in my hands, I can kind of bracket against that 225 or whatever the load may be, and then create more intrinsic or mechanical stiffness or stability. When you go to something like an intensive plyo or a sprint, they obviously do not have that object or external structure to fixate against. So the system gets into almost paranoia mode, it seems, where there just seems to be a lot of disruption or impairment for the athlete to be able to produce the movement. And this is why sprinting and change of direction work become really injury risks early on, or if you don't have the proper backing beforehand. So to progress into this, like I mentioned, lifting weights at a higher rate, or at a faster rate rather, is going to be my bread and butter. So if we're going off of percent of 1RM, you're thinking less than 55%, and doing so with a fast intent or velocity. If you are somebody who practices VBT, then we're looking at 0.85 and up type of spectrum. So these can be any type of lift or movement. I tend to veer a lot towards the landmine, modified Olympic variations, doing things in partial fashion, so doing clean pulls from below the knee rather than from the floor, and again, using something like a landmine for a clean action in lieu of trying to teach or force someone into an actual clean. The accelerated variations are a good one. This is a way that you can kind of introduce them to moving faster, so something like a band push-up, and then it just kind of helps to start familiarizing their system to moving at a faster rate. The intensive plyos, these are ones that are going to be a little bit on the more high amplitude side. We're going to start to get into higher ground contact forces. We're going to get into, hopefully, shorter ground contact times, and then getting into more of like the rebound or reflexive combination patterns using overspeed plyometrics when it's possible, or if we progress that far. And then when we finally do get to the sprint and the change of direction work, I'm largely just going to emphasize broad general techniques. Anything that we try to do to get them sprinting like a 100-meter Olympian is going to be wasted. When you apply it practically for them, they're going to be under, again, those same conditions. So we need to be mindful of that. And I really just use sprint and change of direction work as something to develop the system and then really give them, something to sink their teeth into mentally. Now to take a look at some of the basics on our plyo options. And as we mentioned, we categorize these as low-level plyos, extensive, or intensive plyos. So extensive meaning below arbitrarily, about 75% intensity or exertion, where intensive is above 75%. So here we're thinking higher magnitude, higher force, higher impact, while here we're thinking more rhythmic coordination and kind of introduction to forces. And then with the low-level plyos, again, we're going to be more on the coordination, rhythmic, kinesthetic, or proprioceptive side of things. So if we take a look at a couple of the basics here, the rudiments, we're thinking again about skips, some light bounds, hops, and this can also just kind of open up into general movement flow. But starting out here with just kind of like a hot coals or a skip, with this, I'm just kind of trying to introduce ground contact. We're trying to get the body moving. There's no real specificity to this one, but you will notice that most of these, or a lot of these, will be done without shoes on. Here we're getting into more of an A skip, so now we're having that timing and rhythm component at play, and this is something that for almost every single athlete I've worked with on these is brand new to them. Now we're going into more of an explosive action, so this being a power skip, and as with all the other ones, we're always going to go forwards and backwards, and you can see even obviously here I'm having some trouble with these. So the forwards and backwards component I think is a good one. I think it just helps to kind of broaden or expand that movement literacy or capacity. Now we'll go into a bound series. So here, still sticking with a reasonably low level of intent, still going without shoes. And here we're just working on basic timing, movement, coordination. Again, the forwards and backwards is being applied here. But with these, we're really just kind of teaching them these movements for the first time. So it's not really a high effort or a high volition application. Here, just working some single leg transverse bounds, and again, we'll work backwards with these as well. This is something that really does wonders for a lot of the TBI or brain population as well. And we'll look at one more here. So two-legged hop. So this now getting into a little bit more of an elastic type of movement. We're seeing a little bit higher vertical displacement, but again, working forwards and backwards on this. And then we'll go into a single leg hop, and again, just still keeping a rather low amplitude. This is starting to merge into a little bit more of an intensive plyo, but you were always at the control as the coach of the intent of the exercise. Pogo hop. So this, we're trying to maintain a little bit more of a stiffer lower body. I'm doing an okay job of that here, but we want to see active arms, stiff body, stiff torso, and kind of slapping the ground down as we approach. So now jumping into our extensive plyos, and just to mention real quick too, there are a ton of videos up here on our YouTube channel. I'm just kind of picking out a handful of them, but absolutely feel free to come back and check out more of these. We've got a ton of them in organized playlists. But the extensive plyos, this is where I start to think about transitioning them into introductory force application and expression. So with this, we're going to see higher amplitudes. Some presence of load, moderate, but still presence of load, and potentially moving in some new or different planes of motion or vectors. So we're starting to increase the challenge and the demand here, but this can also be something as simple as a depth jump, broad jump with a stop, and then getting into some combo work like a box 2 depth jump. But first one we'll take a look at here that I'll use quite often is a seated jump to box. This is a common exercise, but what we're getting here with the seated starting position is we're removing the opportunity for counter movement or for the elastic recoil of the stretch shortening cycle. I'm using a little bit of momentum here, but you can do this to where you pretty much start from a dead stop as well. We'll rock into it and create some momentum, and now we're working with more of a muscularly driven jump because we've reduced or removed that stretch shortening cycle, and then jumping to the box is going to remove the presence of eccentric load or force there. So removing the counter movement of the stretch shortening cycle plus removing the eccentric forces makes this a very low demanding exercise, even though it may look like there's a lot going on. Next, we'll take a look here at a medicine ball single leg jump. This is one I've started to actually use a lot more frequently, and the reason why I like using the medicine ball is, again, because it helps to provide the athlete with a sense of biofeedback or reference to help kind of position and leverage themselves to get into optimal angles and optimal positions. Shout out to my boy Rudy here for the guest appearance. But for this, I'll kind of hinge or coil into it, so I'm loading down into the hamstring and then kind of getting that coiling pattern to where I'm closing my right shoulder off to my left hip or my stance hip and using the med ball to help feed that pattern. Then we'll rip through, and now we're going for vertical height or displacement. And on the landing here, very important, make sure that you're cueing to pull down into the hip. And that's another reason why I like the med ball here, is because you'll notice I'm going to actively pull the med ball into my hip, and it's going to help me to stabilize. All right, so one more here, a single leg box jump to stick. This is another one that I think is kind of starting to veer into the more advanced category, but we're using the box to kind of help create some good angles at the hip, ankle, and foot. And what I'm going to do here is drive off and then look to return to a single leg landing here. And what I want you to pay attention to is how active my arms are on both the up and the landing phase here. That is to both drive force in the concentric phase, but more importantly, using the arms to counter lever to help facilitate a good single leg landing without getting any collapsing at the foot, any kind of disposition or valgus, uncontrolled valgus at the knee, getting toppled over on the hip, or kind of getting pulled out of position. So the landing is really the operative point of this one, what we're really interested in. So, again, keep active arms, and then also I'll mention too, with the torso angle, I like to try to think of this as mimicking the shin angle so that we get optimal co-contraction at the thigh. And for our sixth and final pillar, we take a look now at skill acquisition. And skill acquisition is a very fascinating concept in and of itself. And there's, really been a lot of good debate over the last couple of years, and there's been a lot of really interesting research published on the concept of skill acquisition alone. And this is a very dense topic. So this is another one where I think we get skewed a lot with trying to replicate or mimic the traits or the events or actions of sport in the gym, and most often than not, we just do a poor job of it, and it has zero practical conducive nature to it. So we want to look at this simply as developing the physical traits that are required for the tactical skills and the environmental demands, really. So for us, when we're talking about optimizing the athlete, we again want to go back to honing in very sharply on what it is that we do and doing that to the best of our ability. We want to save the tactical and the operational practice and training for those experts. We are a piece of a much bigger puzzle, so it's important that we saturate our time with what we can do and what we can do best, and not waste any time trying to do any of that goofy shit and tying bands to weapons, and it's not necessary, and it just doesn't have any real sense, because the intensity, magnitude, and frequency at which those individuals train those tactical and operational skills is, again, so enormous that any amount of time that we're going to be able to spend, having a couple hours a week or having just a couple of weeks working with somebody is going to pale in comparison. The most tactical specific that we're really going to get is going to be expanding their movement literacy, their movement spectrum. We'll get into some vestibular work and some kinesthetic work where we're starting to add in a reactionary element, or we're starting to add a decision-making component to it. But really, this is even a far cry from being tactical specific, because again, these are traits and qualities that anybody needs or should spend some time trying to develop. What I ultimately boil it all back to, again, is the availability piece, where we can do our best work by just giving them the opportunity to stand on the platform and go do what they do best and do it at a high level for as long as they possibly can, or as long as they want to. Giving them back discretion, giving them decision-making and autonomy over their own career. And a couple of specific examples on this that I've had is guys being able to cancel pending back surgeries or pending foot surgeries that were going to potentially disqualify them or force them to medically retire. I mean, that's a powerful thing, and that doesn't require any sense of tactical mimicry. All it is assessing and viewing them as the individual that they are for the physical deficiencies that they have, and then comparing those to the expertise or the tactical skill sets that you as the coach have. So giving them back this discretion or the empowerment of being able to execute freedom of decision or choice on their bodies and their health and their wellness and their careers is the most powerful impact that you're going to make. Giving them the opportunity to be durable is going to give them more opportunity to go do what they love to do. And to recap everything, if you all made it this far with me, I really appreciate it. Again, I can't thank you enough for your time and your trust in Rude Rock and of course, Virginia High Performance. To see us as a conduit or a resource for information is truly the most flattering or complimentary thing anybody can send my way. So I do appreciate it. And as I mentioned, if anybody has any questions on anything or just even wants to talk shop or bullshit about some of this training stuff, I'm always available to do so and would be happy about it. So nevertheless, just going back through a quick rundown of our major points here, I think that the distinguishable differences between tactical and conventional athletes is really a premium one. It's so easy for us to just continue to assimilate the strength and conditioning community to sport athletes, but the truth is this military population or tactical population needs it as bad or more than anybody on the planet. And for strength and conditioning to start to really get some traction with this population and really start to affect it on a mass scale or a broader scale is fantastic. These men and women sacrifice fucking everything for what they do, and I will always stand by this, that it is the least that we can do to do everything that we can in a professional sense for these individuals. So the training X's and O's here speak for themselves. Think more to just the kind of the temperature of the relationship or rapport with the athlete. Think about, how to communicate. Think about how to empathize and understand where they're coming from, and really try to just simply be the best professional that you can be. We talked about how the health and wellness factor is really the starting point of it all. And to tie right in with that, the sleep piece and the stress management, all of these are just going to be non-negotiable foundations to success for these individuals. These are the competing factors. These are the voids and the deficits. These are the things that have become counterculture to them. And these are the things that we can really give them the most benefit or at least return on investment with. So we have to prioritize it. You're going to battle against injuries. They're going to be the limiting factor. As we talked about, provide solutions and be a problem solver. The individualization piece, this is something that's also going to, again, back you with the rapport side. They want to see that commitment on an individual level. They want to see you actively problem solving and working your way through what were some hiccups or kind of missteps in the training process. But ultimately, we got to close down the gaps between the strengths and the weaknesses. And hopefully I've made this point abundantly clear by now, but treat individuals with respect, treat individuals with reciprocity, make them feel like they are a part of their own outcome, and make them feel that they are actively influencing the total outcome. This is a collective endeavor, and it's important that you just take a step back from being the position of authority or expertise, so to speak, and just let them see the humanistic side of you. I'm going to have a lot more material coming out on restorative strength training and some different ways of applying. But again, I can't thank you all enough for your time. These are the ways to find us over here on the right if you aren't already familiar. Instagram at Rude Rock Strength, YouTube channel, you're already here, and then our website, Rude Rock Strength. Check us out. We've got so much great material that's starting to come out even at a greater rate. So we're really excited for the direction of everything. Thank you, guys.